Hello you wonderful people and welcome to Unravelled. I was perusing through the comments when I came across this one. Kelsey without the H wrote, "Can you crochet an Eevee? My brother loves Eevee and I'd love to make him one." I'd love to, Eevee's so cute, let's get going! The pattern will be displayed throughout, but I do use UK terminology, and I think the only difference in the pattern that I've created today is that a UK double crochet is a US single crochet. And you do also need to know how to do a magic ring, but don't worry, I'll show you how to do that as well. You will need a 3mm crochet hook, a 4mm crochet hook for using the chinchilla yarn, a good pair of scissors, hello, some pins to hold everything together whilst you're sewing up a storm, and 2 different sizes of yarn needles. The longer one with the bigger eye I use for all my weaving in and using the chinchilla yarn, and the smaller one I use for all the embroidery. I don't usually use stitch markers, but I do use some later, but probably not in the way they were intended. In terms of yarn, I used a brown, which is a kind of mocha colour, another brown, which is a chocolate brown, pink, white and black. And for Eevee's fairy bits, I've also got this chinchilla yarn, which is gorgeously soft and you will find fluff everywhere for the rest of your life. The rest of the yarn is standard double knit weight, whereas chinchilla is probably classed as chunky. That was the setup, time for the punchline. You can pause here and have a little read through it, starting with Eevee's head, as I do with most things. A notepad is also handy so you can keep track of where you're up to, because if you're anything like me, you will forget what you're doing whilst you're doing it. We start off the head with a magic ring by wrapping the yarn around our fingers and then pulling a loop through to create this first bit, which I don't count as a stitch. I'm not sure if you're supposed to, but I don't count it as a stitch. Then the subsequent stitches are then pulled through the loop and then through the loop on the hook. And then you'll have to do that 6 times. Once you've got your 6 stitches, my god that's a tongue twister, you can then pull on the short tail to close it and you should have something that looks a little bit like this. Then your first round is to increase in each of those 6 stitches. This is after round 4. Don't be like me and remember to count your stitches after every round. This is after round 8. Notice we're getting a circle and not a hexagon because we're offsetting the even rounds. And now we need to double crochet every stitch in the round. And boom, we're done. If only it was that quick in real life. After the straight rows, we now need to decrease, and every decrease I have in my patterns are always an invisible decrease. Invisible decreases are done by catching the first 2 loops of the next 2 stitches and then double crocheting them together. And unless you do the decrease on every round in the same place, which is not what we're doing, we're offsetting them, you can't really tell where the decreases are. At some point you do want to stop and stuff before the opening gets too small. That's right, it's forbidden candy floss time. I like to take the live stitch off the hook at this point and put it onto my finger just so it's out of the way and the hook doesn't slip and get in the way. As we won't be completely closing the opening to give Eevee a bit of a neck when it comes to sewing onto the body, we can stuff as much as we need to at this point and we can top it up later if there isn't enough. Depending on where you stopped, you may have to continue your decreases whilst there's stuffing in the head. I like to get my finger in there and properly separate the stuffing from the stitches because you can end up pulling the stuffing through the stitches and it's a nightmare to put it back. Woo! First one complete, yeah! We will need to leave a long tail for sewing and then we can do a little slip stitch as a little extra at the end to even out the edge because we are working in spiral rounds and they are notorious for having a little extra blip at the end which doesn't look that pretty. Next up is the body. The body is practically a cone shape and you start off in the same way as the head except you are starting with 4 double crochet stitches in the magic ring and that causes the piece to curve a lot faster. This is after round 18 or so. Here's the head for a size comparison. And you can see that little hole in the head fits nice and neatly on top of the body. Round 22 is done slightly differently, where we do that round and only that round by crocheting into the back loops. This means instead of inserting the hook into the front of both loops, we do it just in one of them, which is the back one, or the one closest to the inside of your work. And that creates a little line that you can see here, which means that any stitches after this point should curve under nice and neatly so your Eevee can sit down without falling over. Oh, I've spotted a loose stitch. I guess this is the back now. The decrease rounds on the bottom are not offset, so you'll notice they'll go double crochet 6, decrease, double crochet 5, decrease, double crochet 4, decrease, etc. for each of the rounds. And this is because it's the bottom, so no one's going to see it, even if it turns out slightly square. We're getting a nice curve now, those back loops are doing the job. And it's decreasing nicely, even though it's slightly hexagonal, but the stuffing should sort that out. Speaking of which, make sure you stuff before you get to the end of the pattern because we will be closing up the body completely and there's no going back if you don't have enough stuffing. Like what happened to me. Well, you could undo it, but I was already quickly running out of time at this point. When you get to a point where you can no longer stick your finger in the way of the stuffing and the stitches, I like to push the stuffing down and pinch it so that we can get to the stitches without getting the stuffing in the way. It can be a bit awkward, especially when you catch the opposite side stitches when you don't mean to, but you'll get there in the end. Just takes some getting used to. Woo! Another bit complete. The body is done. You can see that because we did decrease at the same point on each round, we have a little star pattern, but that's alright. And here you can see that the body is roughly the same size as the head, which is what I was going for. If you want, at this point you can sew the head to the body. I usually leave it all till last because I like to make myself suffer. Next up are the ears, and the main ear pattern is done in the round, and there's a very special reason for this. So Eevee has a two-tone inside of the ear, a dark brown and a black. And when you're sewing these on, you don't really want the sewing to show on the back side. So let's just do a little rewind and I'll show you how we did that. So Eevee's ears are essentially a diamond, and then you flatten that and it becomes an Eevee ear. Another reason for crocheting it in the round as well is because it is then thicker and it's a little bit easier to sew to the head, and they also support their own weight. So no floppy-eared sad Eevee. By adding straight rounds between the increase rounds, we effectively make the end of Eevee's ear double the size it would usually have been if we had only done increase rounds. When you get to the end of the ear, you can also crochet it together so that the stuffing will not leak out the tip. Now for the brown insert to the ear, it's slightly complicated. It's not difficult, it's just it takes some getting your head round. Or it did for me, and I wrote the bloody thing. And these are worked flat, so we need to do a slip knot and chain 7 stitches. Remember, the slip knot does not count as a stitch. And then we're decreasing 1 stitch every other round. But to get a nice isosceles triangle and not a right angled triangle, which is what we want here, we need to decrease on alternate sides of the piece. So I've done this by using decrease stitches, regular decrease stitches, and in some rows there is no turning chain, which also produces a decrease. And now we need to sew it in place. Using some pins, we can make sure it behaves itself, stays in place whilst we are sewing, it doesn't move out weirdly. And you can do the black one at the same time if you want, but I'm going to do them separately. So you should have left a long tail so that we can sew the ear inserts to the main bit of the ear. And I sew them on by going between the stitches of the main ear and then catching the edge of the brown from the top side, making sure that we don't go all the way through the ear. And this sort of undery overy method means that the stitches are effectively hidden, so you can't really tell that they've actually been sewn on. And with that, we're done. I will do a little bit of embroidery to make the line between the black and the brown a bit less obvious. And you can see at the back it's nice and neat, you can't see any of the sewing stitches. Then I noticed that the ears and the body kind of look like a little puppy. Look at the puppy. If you've made it this far, congrats! Proud of you! Next up is the muzzle, the front and the back legs. And if you manage to follow my pattern up to this point, these next 2 bits should be a doddle. The muzzle is a cone done by double crocheting 5 into a magic ring and continuing to increase. The front legs are made by double crocheting 6 into a magic ring, then we have 2 increased rounds, and then we have, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, I can't count that, 11. 11 straight rounds. I can't read my own writing. The back legs are made exactly the same as the front legs, except we only have 9 straight rounds, after which you'll need to stuff and then decrease until closed. Here I'm using the pinching method again and not following my own advice and catching the stuffing like an idiot. And again, you'll also need to leave a long tail so that they can be sewn to the sides of the body. Continuing to sew as we go, I've sewn the ears to the head. They're not quite in the centre of the side of the head, they're slightly back. And I've sewn the top of the muzzle to the centre of the head. When you're sewing it together, you can sometimes get the stuffing that pulls through with the yarn. I don't recommend trying to pull it out because you'll end up with all of it coming out. So the best thing to do is to cut off any excess that you've got poking out and then use anything you can find to try and stuff it back in. It's like it was never there. Next up is the mane, and I could not see anything that I was doing using this chinchilla yarn. The mane is worked flat with Mark, my 4mm hook, my lovely second in command. And he had a right job in his hands trying to navigate through all this fluff, because it did not want to move through any of the stitches at all. The fluff just kept getting stuck. The good thing is though, because I made my stitches slightly looser to accommodate for this, the fluff kinda hides the gaps that's probably there. So after you've done your straight rows, not rounds, which are done without turning chains again so that you decrease by 1 stitch each row, you need to pick up 5 stitches of roughly the centre, which is about 24 stitches from the edge, so that you get a little tuft at the bottom as well. And when you've done crocheting, it will not look like this. You will have to spend some time pulling out the fluffy fibres from each of your stitches, so it doesn't look like Eevee has some kind of fur problem. That's another piece down. We're nearly there. We're nearly there. Just a few more things to go. On to the tail. The tail is started in the same way as we did the ears, by double crocheting 4 into a magic ring. But we're not too bothered about offsetting the even rounds because we will be sewing chinchilla yarn over the top of most, or well, half at least, of the tail. Well, it's probably more like a third. Between a third and a half of the tail will be covered in chinchilla yarn. This is another piece that will be closed, so we need to make sure that we have enough stuffing, and I kept changing my mind and I still don't think I had the right amount. Well, there's no going back now. Boop. For sewing on the chinchilla yarn, I really didn't have a plan. I don't usually have a plan, and this is less of a plan than I usually have, so might as well be no plan. I don't know. I just sewed until it covered roughly the area that I wanted it to, which is between a third and half of the tail. It can be a bit difficult because the chinchilla yarn will be thicker than the gaps between the stitches, and you'll be finding fluff on your furniture for years. When you finish, the fluff will be stuck in the stitches again, so I'm just using a yarn needle to tease it out, and it doesn't look half bad if I do say so myself. If you want to, you can pick up some stitches at the tip of the tail to make it a little bit longer, which I did do and forgot to write down. As an additional step, instead of leaving a long tail to sew the tail to the body, you can pick up and crochet a round of stitches just to give you the little bit of extra purchase when sewing the tail to the body. So I chose a side and whacked in some stitch markers in an approximate circle shape. Turns out I can't crochet in a circle, but it doesn't really matter if it's a bit wonky, because it is just a lip. So to pick up the stitches, I whack Steve between the existing stitches of the tail, pull a bit of the yarn through and then yarn over and pull a second loop through, before tying and securing it in place. I did this approximately 20 times and then I crocheted around on top of it just to give myself a little extra wiggle room, because when I sewed the tail to the body it was kind of difficult to get my hand and the needle in between them. As I say, this is an optional step, you don't have to do it. Instead, you can use that long tail to sew the tail to the body in any direction you want to. So for me, I've opted to put it onto the side because I want the tail to be upright. But if you want to use the long tail, you can also do that. Crochet it on the side, sew it to the side, or you can sew it so the tail is lying down, or any kind of way you want to, really, I suppose. It's your Eevee. Although the tail is the very last thing that you should sew on. We're so close I can smell it. Next up is the embroidery. I've embroidered the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and some toe beans, as well as the little lines between the toes on the front paws. The toe beans are in pink in a simple triangle for the main palm pad, I think it's a palm. When filling a space, if you sew all in the same direction, it really helps to make it look a bit neater. I also try not to pull the embroidery too tight, just guide it to where it needs to be, so that I don't end up with a weird dent where all the embroidery is. And then the toe bit of the toe beans are just little X's that I've put above there at varying heights. So one is 2 rows up and the other 2 are only 1 row up. Now I've already embroidered one of the eyes and now I'm trying to get it symmetrical. And symmetry is not my strong suit. I don't really have a guide on how to do the eyes. I am going to attempt to explain it in the description box below if you want to go and check it out, but it's up to you how you would embroider the eyes yourself. Or if you want, you can also crochet them and sew them on separately. You don't have to do this much embroidery. You can see there I've also done a little triangular nose, which is not quite at the tip, it's just above the muzzle, like peak. You'll also notice that I have extra bits of yarn just poking out of Eevee's head randomly, and that's just to keep them out of the way whilst I'm using one of the other colours, because I use one long piece of yarn to do both eyes. And just to keep them out of the way, I then wrap them around Eevee's ear, and so they wouldn't get tangled up as well. After I've done the main blocking in of the colour, I also go around it again with the black around the edges. So the first embroidered eye outline was an outline, just a sketch, and then after I filled in the gaps with the colours, I then go around it again just to reinforce those lines and make it pop and be a bit more pretty. And then I can cut this yarn and then pop it inside so that it disappears and you can't see it from the surface. Again, you're going to get some of the stuffing poking through with the embroidery, and there's not a lot you can do to prevent that, so it's just best to just fix it by snipping it down or pulling it out. I used some tweezers to get the fine edges, but that took forever. But now we're done. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you very much for the suggestion. It's been a fun one. But now our dear little Eevee needs a name, so any suggestions you have, pop them down in the comments. But for now, that's it from me. So whether you're a girl, a guy, non-binary, hi, or just passing by, I appreciate you lovely people being here. And I'll hopefully see you next time for more Unravelled chaos. Just put my gloves back on. Ah, shit!